Hi everyone, my name is Olivia Spiers, and my thesis centers around trauma and what I call the post-COVID museum. And I zeroed in on this topic through conducting a narrative inquiry study on the Trauma-Aware Art Museum Education Group, or TAAME for short. And before I take you through sort of an overview of my work, let's first get to know the players. So the TAAME group is made up of 6 museum professionals, all of which come from different backgrounds and institutions in the field. So we have Andrew Palomara, who is Associate Director of Docent Learning at the Cincinnati Art Museum. We have Emily Wasquera, who is Senior Manager of Access Programs at the Dallas Museum of Art. Laura Evans, who is Professor at the University of North Texas. Stephen Ligari, who is an art therapist at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Rana Telgen-Ostheimer, who is Head of Education at the Clark Art Institute, and Jackie Armstrong, who is Visitor Experience Researcher at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So the TAAME group is essentially a product of its time for 2 reasons. So one, the group came together during the summer of 2020, which some of us might remember as a time of uncertainty and worry while we were all sheltering in place during quarantines and lockdowns. And during this time, many museum professionals began to form collectives, or what Dr. Portia Moore from the University of Florida calls pop-up groups, that met together online to sort of tackle contemporary issues during the pandemic. And the TAAME group is one of these groups, and the contemporary issue that the group focused on was centered around trauma in the museum during COVID-19. And this focus came out of their collective realization that many people around them, whether that be museum visitors, colleagues, or loved ones, were experiencing trauma as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and also the various violent events of 2020. So upon learning about this group, I was noticing that there's a gap in research that did not really highlight the personal experiences of museum workers during the pandemic. So after COVID, there were many quantitative studies done outlining the sort of depressing statistics in museums, but none that spoke on the humans behind those numbers. So in order to explore this issue and frame the TAAME group as being a sort of snapshot look at what museum workers were experiencing during COVID-19, I formulated my research questions. So I was curious to know, how did the Trauma-Aware Art Museum Education Group come to be? How did their experiences as museum workers influence the group's direction? And what are their goals going forward? And what personal and professional impacts did the group have on its members? So, as a researcher and an art history person, I knew I would have to dive into the past and explore the ways that museum workers throughout history have dealt with large catastrophes like pandemics in order to get a clear look at how the TAAME group's experiences fit into the larger picture in the museum field. So essentially, in order to examine these sort of stories of museum workers past and then connect them to the contemporary TAAME group narrative, I used a theoretical framework centered around Nell Notting's care theory. So a little background for those of you who might not be familiar with this theoretical lens. Nell Notting's established care theory in the 1980s as a fresh look at the ways that moral education benefits classrooms and eventually leads to intrinsic or internal motivation. Care theory, as Nell Nottings describes it, centers around the idea that as educators, first, we should want more from our educational efforts than just academic achievement. And second, that educators acknowledge that academic achievement is not possible unless care is present in the learning environment. So as I dove deeper into care theory as it exists in classroom settings like the one Nell Nottings described, I found Nuala Morris and Alicia Monroe's relational care theory in museums. And the two of them break down sort of demonstrations of care into 2 dynamics, unidirectional care and multidirectional care. And so unidirectional care is very much connected to a carer and a cared for one-way relationship. So this can be from teacher to student or from gallery teacher to visitor. However, multidirectional care is centered around the idea that once care is established in a learning environment, like on a museum tour, this care can travel in many different directions as the conversation flows. So it can go from gallery teacher to visitor, from visitor to visitor, or even from visitor to artwork or visitor to educator. So how do these sort of abstract ideas of care translate to museum practice? This is essentially what I dove into in my literature review. And in this section, I broke down this deep dive into care in museums into 3 parts. So the history of care in museums, what care looks like in the face of COVID-19, and what care's place is in trauma-aware practice, both in the group's frameworks, but also in their dynamics with one another. So I found that the history of care in museums ultimately stems from the museum's role as an institution that preserves and carefully protects precious objects. And so through this historical notion of care, museums in the past have been seen as institutions that benefited society through this careful conservation of rare things. But beyond this sort of deep-rooted sense of care, I also found examples of this sense of bettering the world in past museum offerings. So for example, accessibility programming, which are usually just events or programs that are pointed towards populations that have faced barriers when entering the museum. And these programs that are aimed towards vulnerable populations often fit under the umbrella of what Lois Silverman describes as, quote, inspiring hope and healing, improving lives, and bettering the world. So we can see here that in recent years, workers have sort of reinterpreted the museum's place in bettering society, not to just mean the preservation of objects, but to also mean that museums are a vehicle for well-being, for civic dialogue, and for social change. So in other words, through providing these care-driven programs, museums are offering a place of hope and healing, but also for advocacy in a way that ultimately improves the lives of others, especially those who come from historically underrepresented communities. So this evolving idea of care also began stretching in the face of COVID-19, as many museum workers, such as the T-AAME group members, began articulating what museums should do for communities that were physically, emotionally, and mentally struggling. And they were also wondering what they should do for their colleagues who were experiencing anxiety and dysregulation while trying to push all of their programming online in a way that hadn't really been done before. And so to cope with this stress, many museum workers formed these collectives or pop-up groups to support one another, but also to advocate for change in the field. And as I mentioned, the T-AAME group is one of these groups, and not only are their dynamics centered around care for one another, but their articulated trauma-aware practices are rooted in this historical notion of care and of bettering the lives of others. So in other words, care, as it's seen here, acts as a sort of foundation or bedrock for trauma-aware practice, which centers around nurturing a sense of empowerment and social connection by prioritizing the stories and lived experiences that visitors carry with them when entering the museum. So, in the same way that the T-AAME group centered visitor stories, I centered their experiences through using a narrative inquiry methodology. And so this methodology is centered around the idea that experiences or stories can act as data in a research study, and that these stories ultimately grasp the complexity of human experience. So with this methodology in hand, I planned one-on-one interviews with each of the T-AAME group members over Zoom to gather the sort of pandemic stories of each of the members and get a sense of how the group started and the emotions and personal experiences that were behind the group's beginning in summer 2020. But I also kept in mind that personal stories often reflect life and that both are messy and sometimes hard to put into words. So for that reason, after each of my interviews, I asked the members to send along visual data, such as ephemera or artworks, music, photographs, really anything that they may have made or kept during the pandemic that offered a sort of visual voice to their stories. So I also kept in mind that in narrative inquiry research, it's important to establish researcher positionality because I'm essentially acting as a narrator to their personal stories. So as a way to weave in my own lens as narrator and trauma survivor in, I also collected autobiographical data through journaling. And some of these entries were woven into various points of my thesis. So after collecting all of these different forms of data, I eventually moved on to analyzing. And analyzing for narrative inquiry is essentially writing the story. So in order to do this, I use narrative coding to identify a sort of overarching plot that would then encompass all the different and varying experiences of the TAAME group members. So when analyzing my data, I moved towards putting these transcripts on the screen into story form by writing vignettes that acted as windows into the experiences of each of the TAAME group members. So from there, I was able to establish a time frame for how the group came to be, and also elaborate on some of the group dynamics that started to take shape as they came together. So the idea of the group came from Andrew Palomara, who had the first initial idea to start focusing on trauma during the pandemic, and he eventually reached out to his former graduate school classmate, Emily. And not long after, the two of them called on their former professor, Laura Evans, who had been researching trauma in museum for many years. And from there, the three of them began tackling this issue of trauma in museums during early 2020. But meanwhile, Emily had cultivated many working relationships before the pandemic across the US and across Canada, which led her to take on the role as the group's original anchor, and that many of these working relationships that she forged before the pandemic acted as the sort of connective tissue of the group's beginning in 2020. And these connections of Emily's eventually led to Rana Tolgan-Ostheimer and Stephen Ligari joining the group, who were both able to offer technical and institutional knowledge on trauma-aware resources from Stephen's training as an art therapist and from Rana's studies in educational psychology and extensive work revolving well-being in museums. And so meanwhile, Jackie had sort of been fighting a one-woman army, advocating alone for trauma-aware resources for many years before the pandemic, and while the other 5 group members were coming together. And part of this advocacy came from her own experience as a trauma survivor, but also through her work as a visitor experience researcher at MoMA, where she identified that many visitors were asking for more trauma-aware resources in programming. And eventually, the group came across one of her articles in August 2020 and quickly invited her to join the group. So from establishing the group's beginning, I was able to dive into the personal experiences of each TAAME group member during COVID-19. So all of the group members seemed to remember the places they were and what they were doing when they first learned about COVID. And they all had this sort of initial shock and wave of anxiety. But from this first moment, all of their experiences sort of diverged. And initially, I found a sort of pattern in their stories that split the group down the middle. So I found that 3 members, Jackie, Laura, and Emily, experienced resurfaced trauma. And this is essentially when a past traumatic experience is brought to the surface after experiencing a secondary trauma. This is because trauma exists both in the mind, but also in the body, which causes an almost muscle memory trauma response when a secondary trauma occurs. And for these 3 group members, these responses manifested in hypervigilance, drastic changes in sleeping and eating habits, depression, and an overall sense of isolation. And so ultimately, I ended up resonating with this group in my own lens as narrator because I also experienced resurfaced trauma during the pandemic. And similar to myself, these group members also found that other people they worked with, whether it be students or museum workers, were a lot more vulnerable and open about their struggles and about their hurt. Emily Wuskira even noted that she realized that, quote, trauma was really not unique in museums, as she had many colleagues open up to her about their past trauma during COVID-19. But on the other hand, the 3 other group members, Stephen, Rana, and Andrew, did not experience resurfaced trauma. Instead, they watched the pandemic surge on around them, and then they began pondering critical questions about the field. So one example, Stephen Ligari noted that the shutdown of public places immediately began sparking questions like, what can we do now to be helpful when we don't have the physical space of the museum on hand? And through these feelings of uncertainty, Stephen described that he felt like he'd entered a mourning period for the, quote, sense of growth and momentum that was ultimately quashed with the onset of COVID-19. So through these turbulent emotions and feelings of uncertainty felt by each of the group members, they all relied on unique coping skills, routines, and activities during COVID-19. And this is where my visual data was incorporated into my thesis. As we can see here through these images that some of the group members found solace in creating artworks or spending time with family, gardening, leaning into photography, or creating music. But it's also worth noting that a sense of care for others and for oneself is present in each of these sort of puzzle pieces of visual data. Whether that care is explicit, as seen in the punch needle artwork by Jackie Armstrong that says "we us" and sort of conveys a sense of togetherness, or whether that care is implicit through this careful sense of nurture that's needed for art making, gardening, or music making. And this sense of care ultimately carried over to some of the members' professional lives. One example seen here in Rana Tolgan Ostheimer's newest program, Art and Wellness, which invites people to take part in healing exercises like meditations or journaling alongside a work of art. And while these activities were helpful for each member, the most valuable coping skill ended up being the group itself. And this was a bit of a surprise finding that came upon during my interviews. Each of the members separately emphasized the sort of personal impact the group had on him as I talked to each of them. So some of the members, like Stephen, noted that the group acted as a sort of buffer during the pandemic, which helped him cope with the isolation and gave him a sense of purpose during the pandemic. And Andrew explained that, quote, "I look back on some of those meetings now and I'm just amazed and I'm so grateful that I had that in my life and still do. I think we just really felt secure with each other, and to do writings and conference sessions on the fly in such a meaningful way was pretty incredible and a once-in-a-lifetime experience." So, through reviewing the T-AAME group through a lens of care and examining the care dynamics that existed in their interactions with one another, I began to see that it seemed like the empathetic, collaborative, and care-driven nature of the group led to more productive work. Jackie Armstrong even noted that coming together proved to be a, quote, "easier lift, both intellectually and emotionally." So seen here, the black box depicts the group's writings, all of which were on the Art Museum teaching blog. And while they were actively coming together during 2020, but after forming the entire group, the members were able to reach beyond the Art Museum teaching blog, as seen in the second box, and move on to connect directly with museum workers through channels like NAEA, and move on to formal modes of research dissemination like academic journal articles and book chapters. And their projects are still ongoing as they continue to nail down this sort of new framework of trauma-aware art museum education. But some of their articles articulate the beginning foundation of what the principles and practices of trauma-aware education are in museums. And these essentially revolve around two key points: cultivating a sense of, one, empowerment, and two, social connection in visitors. And some of the practices that T-AAME highlights are already existing in the field, but the group sort of redefines them as trauma-aware. So one example might be prioritizing visitor voice, choice, and experience over art historical information on a tour. And this is already widely practiced by many museum educators, but T-AAME identifies this as trauma-aware specifically because centering visitors' voices is key to instilling a sense of empowerment on a museum tour. And some of the other practices that T-AAME identifies could embolden a sense of trauma awareness in a program. For example, collaborating with mental health professionals would help ensure that trauma-aware experiences are not harmful. So ultimately, the T-AAME group asked museum educators not to hold therapy. We're not therapists, and we're not trained to hold therapy in the galleries, but we can still facilitate therapeutic experiences. Therapeutic here meaning healing. And through collaborating with mental health professionals like social workers or local therapists, we would ensure that these programs are actually healing and not harmful. So these are just a snapshot at some of the principles and practices T-AAME advocates for. If you're curious to know more, feel free to reach out. but already these practices pose implications for the field, as does this research on the group itself. So, for example, museums and well-being is a growing intersection in the field, and the TAAME group work that's outlined in this thesis identifies many key points in trauma-aware practice that could become relevant as museums take on this more holistic well-being approach to outreach and programming. And additionally, the group itself could be seen as a case study displaying the benefits of collaborative work and the importance of care relationships in working environments. TAAME could also be used as a prime example of the ways that museum workers found connection and support during a time of crisis, which could ultimately be replicated in the future when other crises inevitably emerge in our world. And lastly, because TAAME Group serves as a snapshot of the ways museum workers gathered over virtual platforms during COVID, this research could be a sort of first glance at the varying personal ways that museum workers experienced the pandemic and how they began to pointedly critique the field in 2020. So in this way, this thesis could be used as a sort of jumping off point for more research into COVID-era museum education. And along this same vein, some future areas of research might include looking at race and trauma in the museum. So the TAAME group was made up of 6 white museum professionals, which was a limitation for this research. But with this limitation comes future opportunities. So for example, a new study could examine the ways that museum workers of color experienced the pandemic and how or if these experiences differed from that of white museum workers like the TAAME group. This could also act as a foundation for studying race-based trauma in the museum with a narrative lens, which could explore the healing and harmful experiences that visitors of color encounter when entering the museum. And secondly, this thesis could be a starting point for a whole series of action-based research studies. But one example could be a museum educator who implements the principles and practices identified by TAAME and sort of assesses the viability of their recommendations on different populations, such as children or students. And then lastly, I see this research as a starting point for narrative-based museum research. The TAAME group is already getting started on this with their own projects, but one hole that I see is that many studies focus on the experiences of visitors from a narrative perspective, but not really on workers. And so in this way, I think this thesis can be a foundation for sort of turning that narrative lens inward to examine the personal stories of museum workers. So that being said, thank you so much for listening, and please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is on the screen if you'd like to chat more about issues of trauma in museums, and thank you so much.